Irene, we're back.
Yes, we are.
We want to take a moment to thank you for listening, for sharing your comments, and for sharing this podcast.
And I want to offer a tsunami of thanks, too, along with Emmett. And I want to thank each and every one of you who have tweeted us out, who have sent us emails, and have even stopped us in the stores.
We thank you all for listening to us, and keep listening, please. Irene, I am perplexed because there is a cloud over the nation. And I'm wondering, is America in trouble? Over the past few weeks, I've heard phrases such as a new civil war or a cold civil war as an analogy of where America is. And as we end the summer and head into fall.
And into an election year.
Into an election cycle.
That's right.
Is America in trouble? And do you sense a civil war a-brewing?
Well, you know what? We certainly have been in trouble. It really came to the fore the day after our president was inaugurated, because all across the world was the women's movement. It was a magnificent display of what I call righteous anger put into action here. And it was the first time, and it was sort of what I would describe as maybe the third or fourth women's movement, but this one was intersectional because we had our husbands and our brothers and people who were interested in climate change and people who felt that this is the way in which I can bring something forth in this movement to change sort of the tenor of this newly elected administration. So, yeah. Now, what we'll try to figure out, is it a civil war or what? Are we broaching it, or are we already in it, or should we call it something totally different?
Well, I love the fact that you brought up the women's movement because being a huge advocate and a supporter and actually being a part of some of the activities here in Boston, I did see the connection between the election of President Donald Trump and this kind of moment where women were fed up. With being fed up as
sick and tired of being.
That's right.
Being sick and tired as Fannie Lou
Florida
Hamer
Evans quoting Fannie Lou Hamer, right?
That's right.
But there seems to be a rise of domestic terrorism, and certainly a rise of articulations of hate and division, using words as invasions and infestations. And so when we think about the mass shootings, not just in Texas, El Paso, and Ohio, but also going back to Vegas and some of these school shootings, it seems like the rise of white supremacy and of hate and of fear are on the rise.
Well, the very interesting thing is that I never thought it was on the rise. I always thought it was here.
Okay.
What I see is sort of now we see the tentacles of it targeting different groups of people that back in the time that I'm growing up, and we're looking at the 1960s and even before that, the specific target were black men. But now that we have seen the browning of America, and we've seen, a kind of, we're trying to crawl towards a multicultural democracy and a participatory government, now we see that kind of white supremacist ideology impacts all people of color, women, LGBT folks. So what we now see that we didn't see, and it's not that it was anemic, you're seeing far more people fight back and far more people paying attention. Now, it's not that the country and the world wasn't paying attention to the civil rights movement, but we didn't have that kind of aggregated number. And the way that you now see how its tentacles impacts everyone.
When you think back to the civil rights movement and clearly being there and being a part of it, did you consider that it was a war? I mean, did you see it as a sentiment of war? I mean, clearly we have, the Civil War, which we know was an internal war. We have the Vietnam War, some would call the conflict or whatnot. But did you see the civil rights movement as a war against white supremacy, or did the notion of war even come into play?
No, it didn't. Although I have to say that we're beginning to hear a lot of that, and certainly Eddie Glaude is saying that. But I think I would use a different kind of terminology. I see it as a sort of a civil rights revolution or another Reconstruction. So, for example, right after our first Civil War, there was that Reconstruction period.
Mm-hmm.
And with that comes this kind of civil rights kind of issues, because to expand the Constitution to mean people of color. So we had the 13th, 14th, and 15th
Mm-hmm.
Amendment. So that's part of the first Reconstruction. The
Mm-hmm.
second Reconstruction is that civil rights movement. And what we get is, Brown versus Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act, and we get the Voting Rights Act. And so now what I see here, as we again expand, we're in what I think William Barber calls a third Reconstruction. But I think the issue here, because so many are always talking about the founding fathers, and I know you can relate to this because we wrestle with this as a Bible. Is the Constitution a static document, or is it a living constitution? Because if it's a static and we're talking about it being fixed, it's sort of like when we talk about the Bible. If we're a literalist about it, well, that means no women, no blacks, no LGBTQ.
Right. Only white guys.
Okay,
Yeah.
but not only that, but we're talking about the centrality of what I would describe as heterosexual white males.
Yeah.
So if you even a gay white male,
Right.
you're not in this calculus.
And on top of that, if we look at the Constitution, it's really only, heterosexual, heteronormative white males who owned land.
Property, absolutely.
Right? So even folks without property, without real estate, wouldn't fit. And so I think, you asked a question, I think the Constitution is a living document. There's a spirit of what I think was intended, but I don't think it's a fixed document, which is why we have the three chambers of government, and
we're
all that
having
kind of piece.
and we continue to have this argument. See, because I think that if you see it as a living document, you have to see it in light of the time in which we live in. It's sort of like what we do with the Bible. And so what happens here is that you'll get the right saying we're against identity politics.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, because you're decentering heteronormativity.
Right.
Okay, so that poses a serious problem because you want some women in here.
That's right. That's
That
right.
you want that happening.
Right.
You want some. Well, I definitely want some LGBT
Well, you
folks
want a
up in here.
cross section of the individuals who are living within within
Right.
the country.
So-
But you mentioned Professor Eddie Glaude Jr., who's the chair of the Department of African American Studies and the James S. McDonald Distinguished University Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. We've listened to him over the last couple of weeks, and I want to play this
He's
clip
brilliant.
of him talking about his interpretation of where we are, and he invokes this analogy of a cold civil war.
Cold
Let's
Civil
listen.
War. Okay.
What happens when we use language like infestation, children? You use this, Governor, children.
Yes.
Carrying perhaps disease across the border. What happens? You set the stage for people who are even more on the extreme to act violently. We are in a cold civil war. We are in a cold civil war. And there's some people who bear the burden of it.
Yeah.
Irene, are we in a cold civil war?
Well, let's extrapolate that analogy. So we got to think, who are the Confederates and who are the Union?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
who's in those camps?
But of course, we call it the Civil War, which kind of reveals where we were educated. Because if we were in the South, we would call it the
Northern aggression.
Right, the War of Northern Aggression.
And if you're like me, who grew up in Brooklyn, what I always say that with that Mason-Dixon line is it makes a distinction that if you're below it, you're down south, and if you're above it, you're up south. So, and what we do understand about the Civil War, while we can really pinpoint some very active players in it, the North provided the ships, all of that. So when we talk about American slaveocracy, everybody was involved. But using his metaphor, so who would be the Confederates to me? So I think of the birthers, okay, certainly white nationalists, white evangelicals,
Some of them.
okay.
There are
Okay.
some good white evangelicals.
Okay,
Irene.
amen.
I'm going to
I'll
stand
say
for
that
some of my brothers
anemically.
and sisters.
Amen.
Some of them.
But I'm saying it anemically.
I hear you.
Okay,
You
NRA.
have air quotes.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right. That's right.
Okay, NRA. Mhm.
NRA. I mean, what more? I mean, that's a large swath. Oh, Tea Party, right? When you-
Interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I think when I began to see a bubbling of something was during Barack Obama's election. When he's even running for president, it was the whole idea birthed that he wasn't part
Yeah.
of the United States. And wait a minute now, Trump was leading that.
Well, he at that point, he wasn't necessarily leading. He was clearly involved, but the Tea Party, which presented itself as kind of a group of Republicans who were really about economic populism and kind of about a different way of doing the Republican thing. But under that was the kind of fear of the browning of America.
That's right.
And folks, early on were saying that, but nobody wanted to believe it. But now hindsight is 20/20, as we say, and we can see what that was about. So I think your list is pretty accurate.
But the interesting thing is, so the browning of America, we've been hearing that for 20 plus years, really. Now, I think that in hearing that, nobody really understood that. I mean, at least me, in terms of, the browning of America. But in terms of this way, I never thought it would not be a power struggle. I didn't think that because there would be more people of color, that whites who have maintained power, the power structure, for centuries would absolutely change. The interesting thing is with Donald's slogan, to make America great again, in 1980, Ronald Reagan, which is why they evoke him so much, his slogan in 1980 was, let's make great again.
Yeah.
And then when he ran again, it's like, it's morning again in America. But during that decade, we really began to see the erosion of civil rights, because this is where we get into a bunch of arguments about resegregation and sort of overturning affirmative action.
Was Reagan's slogan "Make America Great Again," or was it "Good Again," or what was?
It was let's make America great again.
For those who've abandoned hope, we'll restore hope and we'll welcome them into a great national crusade to make America great again.
To me, Donald is a manifestation, and a symptom. But when we understand the DNA of America and how we went from, we said it, before, to 250 years. Slavery, 90 years. Jim Crow, 60 years, separate and unequal. It has always been happening.
Well, invoking those numbers, we can clearly see that it was not all Donald Trump's fault. And I really don't want to talk about him at all. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, let's continue to process this notion of the cold Civil War, whether it was cold or not, and if the Civil War analogy works or not.
Yeah, or what it would look like.
Yeah.
Because would we be out in the streets fighting?
Oh, my goodness. Now we definitely need a break.
Okay.
You're listening to the All Rev'd Up podcast. We'll be right back. So, Irene, before the break, we kind of laid out who the Confederate would be. I'm thinking that the Union would essentially be all freedom, justice loving.
You and me.
You and I, folks who are committed to equity, who are committed to inclusivity, who are committed to
justice.
Yeah. I mean, it just seems like that way, although it seems too simple. But it seems too simple.
Well, you know what it is? It's largely because that group it's much bigger than the actual people who are on the Confederate side.
You think so?
Well, I think we can identify that. I mean, the thing that we saw was when we look at sort of justice-seeking people. So when I look at certain, I remember the Occupy movement. We now have Black Lives Matter movement. We now have the Me Too movement. I mean, we have those, and in all of those, just those three that I named, and I can name, we got the people who are, environmentalists, activists. When you look at those people, that particular group is multicultural, and it intersects a number of issues, not just climate change, but it'll intersect all these other issues. But with the Confederate side, it's a clear demarcation in that all of them are white, all of them espouse the same ideology. It's almost like I hate to say this, but like religious zealots, sort of no critical thinking about how that impacts them. But they're buying into this sort of what I call homogenized sort of concept of whiteness, not understanding two things. One is that the Republican Party might want your vote, but don't want your vices. And number two is that depending on your white ethnicity and class has a lot to do with how much white privilege you have. So to think that you are like Donald Trump, that's delusional.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of this is based on not just white fragility, but also white fear. And it's almost as if the fear of losing the privilege or the platform of whiteness is creating so much mass hysteria that folks are actually willing to go out and kill people.
Yeah, I call it dying of whiteness. That's what I see when you look at El Paso, when we look at Dayton, Ohio, the most recent incidents, and certainly I even think that Dylan Roof would have been fine to go out in a blaze of glory. So you're absolutely right with that.
So it seems that the Civil War analogy actually works pretty well. What about cold? Is it a cold war or is it a hot war? What's brewing?
It's been brewing.
Okay.
It's been brewing. I mean, it sort of makes me think of, what William Faulkner says, that the past is never dead. It's not even past.
Yeah.
So that's why I said that I just think it's been a continuous flow.
Well, I can understand that, and you make a good point, but I think of the Cold War with the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which goes back to 1947 and kind of ended in 1991. But you and I will remember the hot part of the Cold War, which was 1985 to 1991, where you had President then Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. And, there was actually not much fighting, but there was a lot of talking and a lot of these episodic moments where things were kind of getting hot and heavy, but it was still considered a Cold War.
Yeah, I guess for me, Emmett, and that's it. When I think of the Cold War, I think about Russia. I can't seem to, sort of separate that from that image. So when I think about it, and I guess maybe that's why I'm having a hard time with it being a Cold War, because I just feel like Donald is in Putin's pocket. So, there's a bromance going on between these two that I've never seen before. And then when we hear, whether we believe it or not, that they had a profound impact on the outcome of the election, I can't think of that as, I think of that as a different kind of, dynamic than what I see in terms of white supremacist terrorism and the need for a, anti-domestic terrorism bill being passed. And my argument, this is what I posit that if they had ever passed an anti-lynching bill, then we would have had the first hate crime bill, on the record. But it took something like 1998 with, Matthew Shepard and with James Byrd to get what was called the James Byrd Matthew Shepard hate crime bill. And that even that people excise James Byrd out of it and call it Matthew Shepard hate crime bill. But what I'm really getting at is that it wouldn't be hard to me to pass something like that if they had done anti-lynching. It would have said what our children are saying, Black Lives Matter, if they had an anti-lynching bill. That's still on the table.
It's still on the table, but I have to back up just for a second because I just can't blame Donald Trump for everything. And I'm no supporter of his. Let me just say that on the air. But the challenge for me is that he doesn't represent all people, and he's not the Grand Wizard of the KKK, Ku Klux Klan. He's not the
But he gets a nod from David Duke.
Yeah, but that's a nod from a group of people who already believe what he perhaps is espousing.
Yeah, but he does the moral equivalent when we look at Charlottesville in 2017, with Heather Heyer, who was killed in that incident, when he says, that there were good people on both sides. So, no, of course, it doesn't fall on him, but he is now, he holds the highest office in the land, and he also represents the powers that be that can affect change. I really do get you, because the real argument here, when Glaude talks about othering or other rising, there's this belief by many whites, whether they're privileged or not, that it's about their birthright, it's about citizenship, and it's about entitlement. And that's what I see, that when you get someone, like the recent killings by these young men, they don't come from privilege, but it's an ideology that they buy into. And what bothers me is that when they do something like this is called mental illness, but you could rest assured if it was a person of color, it'd be about innate criminality in your DNA.
Well, I'm just going to pause for that just for a quick second, because you dropped a load on that one. It is ironic that when these young white males commit these heinous acts, these atrocious horrific, I don't even know what to call them,
Yeah.
that the result of the analysis, particularly under this presidency, is that it's a mental wellness issue, and that we need to focus on that rather than to focus on their access to tools of war, right?
And the ideology,
and the ideology
that even in your sixth state
Yeah.
gets you to go and kill people in mass numbers.
You dropped one on that one. So you have a question that you've been asking, and perhaps we can entice our listeners with this question. What is it?
Well, just as well, actually, my question is to you and those of us who are certainly ministers and people of faith. What should we be doing? How do we engage folks to do something about this political and spiritual climate that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, this is a beautiful question, and the reason why I wanted you to kind of open it up for everyone is that as those of us who believe that we are, if this is a war, and we use this analogy, those of us who believe that we're on the Union side, who are peace-loving, justice-oriented, people, regardless of where you come from, regardless of what walk of life you're in, that I think we need to do more to be more vocal and more present about what we believe. And I don't mean just to pontificate that and just to say it, but to live it out, to walk it out. So if we are ambassadors of love and keepers of the peace and extenders of grace and mercy and pursuers of justice, then I think we should walk that and do that and be that.
I so agree here. I'm reminded of something that by Martin Luther King. He said there's two types of leaderships. He says there are thermometers, and these are people who sort of take the temperature of the room, and then they're thermostats that change the room. So I think in many ways that we need to change the atmosphere in the room. But I'm also reminded of this. I always say this, that the power of the people is far greater than the people in power. And I'm of this nature because I'm a fighter, that we will fight until hell freezes over, and then we will fight on the ice.
I know that's right. Well, you just invoked Dr. King. I want to invoke another person as we move to our closing here. On August 5th, the world lost a legendary humanitarian, a writer, and an educator, Chloe Ardella Wolford, also known as Toni Morrison. Today, as my parting blessing, I leave you these words inspired by her works and her life. Beloved, whether you have the bluest eye or not, whether you have a friend named Sula or not, whether you have embraced the trilogy of being beloved, engaging in jazz, or exploring paradise, let us all pursue mercy, or a mercy, as she wrote. Whether you are playing in the dark or dreaming of Emmett Till, I pray that you will experience the power, peace, and love of home, and commit your life, as our big sister, Professor Morrison, did, to the pursuit of peace and justice for all. Amen.
And Ashe.
All Rev'd Up is a production of WGBH.
Our producer is Tori Bedford. Our marketing and social producer is Cavante Small. This episode's recording engineer is Doug Sugarts. Music for this episode is from Lee Roosevelt.
Additional thanks to Nina Porzuki, Kate Ida, John Ryan, Phil Rado, Chelsea Mers, Meredith Mearman, and Zach Waldman.
If you like what you hear, let us know and give us a review on Apple Podcasts.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of All Rev'd Up.
I love that Toni Morrison. I love Toni. Oh man, I love Toni.